She confided everything in her support group. One member was recording her. There's a kind of trust that doesn't come easy. The kind you build slowly, in a room full of strangers who've all been broken by the same kind of pain. You don't hand that trust over quickly. You test it. You watch people. You listen to how they talk about their own wounds before you dare to show yours. And when you finally decide to open up, when you finally say the things out loud that you've never said to anyone, you do it because you believe, with everything in you, that you are safe. Marissa believed that. For 14 months, she believed it completely. And then, one Tuesday morning in October, she opened her phone and watched her entire life collapse in real time. But to understand what happened to her, really understand it, you have to go back to where it started. You have to go back to the version of Marissa that existed before the group, before the trust, before everything she thought she knew about healing turned into the most devastating betrayal she had ever experienced. Marissa Crane was 34 years old when her marriage ended. Not ended like a slow fade. Ended like a demolition. Her husband of 6 years, a man she had built her entire adult life around, sat across from her at their kitchen table one Sunday morning and told her, calmly, that he had been in love with someone else for 2 years, that he had already moved money out of their joint accounts, that his lawyer had already drawn up the papers, that he was sorry, but he wasn't. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there, holding her coffee cup, watching the steam rise, while something inside her quietly went dark. The months that followed were the kind of months people don't talk about honestly. She lost 20 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. She stopped answering her phone. She called in sick to her job at a marketing agency so many times that her manager pulled her into an office and gently told her that one more absence would require HR involvement. She started having panic attacks in grocery stores, standing in the cereal aisle, shaking, unable to remember what she came in for. Her sister flew in from Phoenix for 2 weeks, and then flew back. Her friends sent check-in texts that she never replied to. Her therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Pacheco, suggested that individual sessions might be supplemented by something more, a community. A place where Marissa could hear other people's pain and realize she wasn't alone in hers. That's how she found Heartwork. Heartwork was a support group for women recovering from emotional trauma, specifically, the kind of trauma that comes from relationship betrayal, divorce, infidelity, abandonment, the invisible wounds that don't show up on an X-ray, but make it hard to breathe some mornings. It met every Thursday evening in the basement of a community wellness center in her neighborhood. 12 folding chairs arranged in a circle, a small table with a coffee maker and a box of tissues that always seemed to be running low. A facilitator named Caroline, a licensed social worker in her early 50s with a warm face and a voice that made you feel like she had seen everything and nothing could shock her. The rules were simple and stated clearly at the beginning of every session. What's shared in this room stays in this room. No recording. No phones out. No screenshots. No sharing stories outside the group without permission. Marissa remembered sitting in that circle for the first time, listening to the rules, and feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Relief. She didn't share much that first night. She sat. She listened. She cried a little when another woman named Diane described the exact feeling of sleeping in a bed that suddenly felt 3 times too wide. She went home and slept better than she had in weeks. She went back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. And slowly, over the course of several months, Marissa began to talk. She talked about the morning her husband left. She talked about finding a credit card statement she wasn't supposed to see 3 months before he finally admitted the truth. She talked about the panic attacks. She talked about the specific humiliation of having to tell her mother that the marriage was over and watching her mother try to hide the fact that she wasn't entirely surprised. She talked about the nights she sat on her bathroom floor because the bathroom was the only room in the apartment that felt small enough to hold her. She talked about things she hadn't told her therapist. She talked about a miscarriage she and her husband had never discussed with anyone outside of their marriage. She talked about an incident, not physical, but emotionally abusive, that happened 6 months before the divorce that she still didn't have the language to fully describe. She talked about her fear that she was fundamentally unlovable, that something was broken inside her that she would never be able to fix. The group held her words carefully. They nodded. They cried with her. They shared their own versions of the same darkness. And in that circle, surrounded by those women, Marissa started, slowly and painfully, to heal. She didn't know that every word she said was being recorded. Her name was Paula. She had joined the group about 2 months after Marissa. Quiet, observant, always well-dressed in a way that felt slightly out of place in a fluorescent-lit basement. She said she was recovering from a painful breakup with a long-term partner. She cried at appropriate moments. She said the right things. She brought homemade cookies once, and everyone appreciated it. Marissa liked her. They got coffee twice after Thursday sessions. They texted occasionally. Paula asked good questions and remembered the details of what you told her, which Marissa found touching. What Marissa didn't know was that Paula had been writing a podcast. Not just any podcast. A true crime-adjacent, confessional drama podcast that had been gaining traction in certain online corners. The concept was simple: real stories of real women, talking about their most private traumas, without the women's knowledge or consent. Paula called it raw. She told her co-host it was unfiltered authenticity. She described it as giving a voice to untold female pain. What it actually was theft. Paula had been recording sessions using a small device she kept in her jacket pocket. She had also, on 2 separate occasions, recorded the individual coffee conversations she and Marissa had after group. She had hours of audio. Hours of women, real women with real names and real lives, describing the worst moments of their existence, completely unaware that any of it was being captured. The podcast launched quietly in September. It had a waiting list. It had a Patreon. Paula had been careful enough to change the names, but not careful enough to change the details. And in early October, one of those details found its way back to Marissa. She was at work when it happened. A colleague named Jean forwarded her a link with no context, just a message that said, "You need to listen to this." Marissa put her headphones in at her desk. The episode was called The Kitchen Table. It was 22 minutes long, and within the first 4 minutes, Marissa felt the blood drain from her face. The voice in the podcast was hers. Distorted slightly, pitched down, but unmistakably hers. The words were hers. The story was hers. The kitchen table, the coffee cup, the divorce papers, the Sunday morning. Changed just enough to be technically deniable. Not changed enough to be unrecognizable to anyone who knew her. She sat at her work desk, completely still, while the episode continued. They had used the story about the miscarriage. They had used the story about the incident she still didn't have language for. They had used the moment to bathroom floor. They had used everything. She took her headphones out. She sat there for exactly 3 minutes, staring at her screen. And then she walked to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and had the worst panic attack she'd had in over a year. The next 48 hours moved in a strange, dissociated blur. She listened to more episodes. There were 11 of them. She recognized at least 4 other women from the group. Diane's story about the bed. A woman named Kezia whose story about her mother had made the entire circle cry. A quiet woman named Rosa who had only spoken a handful of times, but had shared something deeply personal about financial abuse. All of them. Taken. Packaged. Sold to an audience that thought they were consuming honest, raw storytelling. Marissa called her sister. Her sister told her to call a lawyer. She called Dr. Pacheco, who was horrified and immediately said she would cooperate with anything Marissa needed. She called Caroline, the group facilitator, and the moment Caroline answered the phone and Marissa started to speak, Caroline broke down crying. She had already heard from 2 other members. And then Marissa did something that would turn out to be the most important decision she made in the entire ordeal. She didn't call Paula. She documented everything first. This is where the story shifts. Because up until now, this is a story about violation. About a woman who trusted and was betrayed by someone who had disguised predation as solidarity. But from this moment forward, it becomes something else. It becomes a story about what happens when you underestimate someone who has already survived being underestimated once. Marissa had worked in marketing for 11 years. She understood content. She understood audiences. She understood how something gains traction online, and, more importantly, she understood how it loses traction. She also, thanks to the worst year of her life, had become intimately familiar with the legal landscape of emotional abuse documentation, because her divorce attorney had walked her through it in painstaking detail. She spent 4 days building a case before she contacted anyone outside her immediate circle. She cataloged every episode. She time-stamped every moment of recognizable detail. She got statements from 3 other group members who had identified their own stories. She reached out to Dr. Pacheco, who connected her with a patient advocate at a trauma research organization who had dealt with similar cases. She tracked down the podcast's hosting platform, the Patreon page, and the social media accounts Paula used to promote it. And then she found the first twist she hadn't seen coming. Paula wasn't working alone. The co-host of the podcast, a man who went by the name D, and whose voice appeared only in the intro and outro segments, was Paula's boyfriend. His real name was Derek. And Derek, it turned out, worked in audio production for a mid-sized digital media company, a company that had quietly acquired the podcast rights to Unfiltered 6 weeks after launch, just before the Patreon started pulling in real money. This wasn't just a person with a recording device and a passion project. This was monetized, structured. Legal entities were involved. There was a contract. Marissa stared at the acquisition paperwork her attorney had located through public filings and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not despair, not panic, clarity. Because if there was a media company involved, there was a media company that could be held accountable. The attorney Marissa retained, a woman named Vivian who specialized in privacy law and had a reputation for being quietly vicious in depositions, sent the first letter on a Wednesday. It was addressed to the podcast's hosting platform, the media company that had acquired the rights, Paula personally, and Derek personally. It outlined the illegal recording of private support group sessions, the use of identifiable personal information without consent, the violation of multiple state statutes regarding audio recording laws, the emotional damages caused to identified individuals, and the commercial profit derived from stolen trauma. The letter also noted that Marissa and the other affected group members were prepared to go public with their identities and their stories if the matter was not addressed immediately. 24 hours later, the podcast went dark. Every episode pulled. The Patreon suspended. The social media accounts deleted. For approximately 15 minutes, Marissa allowed herself to think that it might be over. It wasn't. 3 days after the podcast disappeared, an anonymous account posted a thread on a popular social media platform. The thread claimed that a vindictive ex-member of a support group was trying to silence a podcast that gave voice to real female pain. It described Marissa, without using her name, but with enough specific details that anyone who knew her would recognize her immediately, as someone who was weaponizing lawyers to protect herself from accountability. Accountability for what? The thread didn't say. It didn't need to. It was designed to make the audience fill in the blank with something sinister. The thread got traction. Then it got a lot of traction. Then journalists who covered the creator economy started reaching out to Paula for comment. This was the second twist. Paula wasn't hiding. She was pivoting. She had anticipated the legal response, and she had a counter-narrative ready. She framed herself as a grassroots storyteller being crushed by a litigious woman with resources. She positioned the group members as a collective being silenced. She gave an interview, carefully worded, never technically defamatory, to a podcast in the true crime space that had twice the audience her own show had ever reached. For about a week, the internet believed her. Marissa watched it happen in real time, and for the first time since the kitchen table incident, she felt truly, completely alone. But she hadn't shared everything she knew yet. Here is the thing about someone who records people without their knowledge. They tend to believe that they are the only one paying close attention. Paula had recorded Marissa. What Paula did not know was that Marissa, during their individual coffee conversations, had gotten into the habit of taking voice memos on her phone. Not of the conversations, but of her own thoughts and feelings immediately after them. She had started doing this on the advice of her therapist, as a way of processing her emotions in real time. And on one of those voice memos, recorded in a parking lot immediately after coffee with Paula, Marissa had described something that Paula had said to her privately. Something that directly contradicted the public narrative Paula was now building. Paula had told Marissa, in that coffee shop, that she had reached out to a media company about the podcast because she believed the stories were too powerful to stay underground. She had said, and Marissa had the memo, dated and time-stamped, that she knew the women in the group would never consent if asked directly, so consent wasn't really the right framework. That one sentence, Vivian called it a gift. Marissa didn't release the memo herself. Vivian made sure of that. Instead, The memo was submitted as part of an expanding legal filing that now included not just privacy violations, but a pattern of intentional deception. The media company, upon receiving the updated filing, made a decision that corporate legal departments tend to make when they realize the person they acquired content from had concealed material facts from them at the time of acquisition. They settled, quickly and quietly. Paula and Derek settled separately, and the terms were sealed, but the settlement was structured in a way that required both of them to issue a public statement. The statement was not an apology. It was careful language drafted by their attorneys. But it confirmed that the recordings had been made without consent, that the content had been used commercially without authorization, and that affected individuals had been harmed. It was enough. And then came the third twist, the one that Marissa herself hadn't planned, hadn't strategized, hadn't even fully anticipated. Caroline, the group facilitator, had quietly reached out to a journalist at a long-form publication that covered digital media ethics. A journalist who had actually been investigating the monetization of trauma content for 8 months, and who, when she received Caroline's email, recognized immediately that this was the story she had been looking for. The piece ran on a Thursday, the same day of the week that the group met. It was long. It was detailed. It named the media company. It named the acquisition. It named Derek. It did not name Paula directly, because the journalist had agreed to protect the identities of the podcast creator at the time of publication, but it described the pattern of behavior in enough detail that Paula's name was already circulating in comment sections by the end of the day. The piece also did something that Marissa had not expected. It named Marissa, not as a victim, not as a plaintiff, as a source, as a woman who had chosen to go on record with her full name and describe exactly what had been taken from her, and exactly what it felt like to have her most private pain turned into someone else's revenue stream. The response was not what Marissa had braced for. Women flooded the comments. Women who had been in support groups. Women who had confided in people they trusted. Women who had never been recorded but who recognized the violation immediately because they understood, at a cellular level, what it means to have a safe space weaponized against you. The article was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Paula's counter-narrative collapsed overnight. In the weeks that followed, Marissa gave several more interviews. She worked with a nonprofit focused on digital privacy to help draft a set of proposed guidelines for support group privacy protections in the age of portable recording devices. Dr. Pacheco submitted testimony to a state legislature committee reviewing audio consent laws. 3 other women from the group, including Diane and Kezia, chose to share their own experiences publicly. The media company that had acquired the podcast quietly restructured its content acquisition process. 2 other Raw Confession podcast ventures, which journalists had begun investigating in the wake of the story, shut down before they could be formally named in any reporting. And Heartwork, Caroline moved the group to a new location. She implemented a physical phone check-in policy at every session. She redesigned the intake process to include explicit informed consent documentation. The group grew, not in spite of what happened, because of what happened. Because when you survive having your vulnerability exploited and you choose to name it out loud instead of quietly disappear, something shifts. In you and in the people watching you. Marissa sat in the circle the first Thursday after the article ran. There were 17 shares instead of 12. She didn't say anything at first. She sat with her coffee, watching the steam, the way she had that Sunday morning at the kitchen table when everything first fell apart. But this time, the quiet didn't feel like darkness. It felt like something else. Like the kind of silence that exists before you choose, deliberately, and with full knowledge of the cost, to tell the truth. She said, "I'm Marissa, and I'm still healing. But for the first time in a long time, I actually believe I'm going to get there." The room held her words the way it always had. Gently, carefully, completely. This time, she knew it was real. There is something deeply specific about what Paula did that goes beyond the legal violations. It goes beyond the privacy statutes and the settlement terms and the media company restructuring. It lives in a more uncomfortable place than any of that. She took the precise thing that makes human beings capable of surviving the worst experiences of their lives, the ability to confess pain to another person and have that pain witnessed, and she turned it into a product. She didn't just steal stories. She stole the act of trusting. She made vulnerability itself feel dangerous. And that's the kind of damage that doesn't show up in a settlement. That's the kind of damage that lingers in every room where someone is trying to decide whether to open their mouth and tell the truth about what has happened to them. What Marissa understood, and what she chose to do with that understanding, is the part of this story that matters most. She didn't let the damage become permanent. She named it. She documented it. She built a case. She found the people who could help. She went on record. And when she sat back down in that circle, among women who were still deciding whether they could trust a room after what had happened to all of them, she modeled something essential. That surviving betrayal isn't about never being hurt again. It's about refusing to let the person who hurt you write the ending. Marissa wrote her own, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like exactly the right story to tell.